us again. I'm Jeff Stevens, and I'm part of the Friends of Middleborough Cemeteries, and this is the third of our programs that we're calling Welcome to Middleborough's Historic Cemeteries. And this is obviously the first time we've been outside for this kind of thing, and yet it's the place to go. My strong advice to everybody is come out, walk through some of these locations. We're actually right across the street today from perhaps one of the easiest ones to find, easiest ones to locate, and an incredibly rich historic resource in this community, and that's the cemetery at the Green. And we'll talk a little more about that. But I thought before we did that, we might kind of get based on where we are. And part of the name of that place, Cemetery at the Green, has to do with what this area was. This is Route 105 behind me. You can see a heavily traveled road. But historically, this was the center of Middleborough. So when we talk about colonial time, things up through the American Revolution, this was the center of town. Route 44, which is just a half a block over there, didn't exist, and yet there were streets coming right through here. Up further, the center of town, what we now call the Four Corners, was not the center of town. And so this was the center of Middleborough historically. Much of Middleborough was already being developed as farmland, and this is after the early days of 26 Man's Purchase, when this land was first purchased from the native peoples. On the Green, or at the Green, and correctly now I read from checking the history, it should be at the Green. And the original Green, I'm going to walk over here and point down, because down there is where the Green was. That busy intersection where we have Wood Street and a couple of things coming together, Plymouth and Plimpton and you name it, the 3 or 4 streets all coming together. That was the original Green and the original location. There was one important thing, of course, for any community, and that was the center of social life. Sprout Tavern was down there, and Sprout Tavern was, again, owned by local folks and was a stop for the stagecoaches and those kinds of things. Part of having a green had to do with early colonial requirements to be a town. To be a town, they required in those days that any man who was capable of handling any kind of a weapon had to be trained. And with that, there was supposed to be in every community, to be an identified community, there had to be a place to be trained. And that's what the Green was. It was a place for military practices, and with that, they established a Green. Now, candidly, Middleborough did not do an awful lot with training their folks. And up through the 1670s, we didn't really live up to our responsibilities, and they kind of picked on us a little bit for some of that. What really kind of got Middleborough into this came with King Philip's War. And King Philip's War, which happened in the 1670s, all of Middleborough was burned down practically. There was almost nothing left as the town was attacked by the native people during King Philip's War. When they came back to Middleborough after that from Plymouth, there was more involvement in the military and the militia. Then another section was used. That started to have some problems, too many streets coming together, a number of other things. And where we're standing right here, which is on the front of the Congregational Church right here, this became what was called the Upper Green. Lower Green, Upper Green. And this actually is where most of the Revolutionary War training would have been done, is in this area. And this area became the center of the excitement around Revolutionary War times. And they did have a liberty pole down there. In 74, there was a liberty pole erected on the Lower Green, but the actual training happened up here in the Upper Green. So this is the place where Middleborough was centered, and very much where the military training went on. And there was one very interesting thing right down here too, I'm told, is where there was an early school in colonial times. And one of Middleborough's more interesting characters, Deborah Sampson, taught at that school. Deborah Sampson, if you don't know that name, is famous because she spent 3 to 4 years living as Roger Shurtleff as a male in the colonial army. And it was amazing that she survived that long without being discovered. Candidly, Middleborough was, when she was discovered and thrown out of the army, she came back to Middleborough and was basically run out of town, one of our better moves. But historically, she's an interesting character because she was a woman who was in the army for 4 years, serving as a man. While we're here, we really should not fail to mention that the church that is here. And so we'll get a better picture that I'm sure Laurie will show you during the time we make this film. But the first Congregational church, that was another requirement of colonial times, that a community have a church. And this was called Christ Church at first. Later on, it became the Church at the Green again, and that is its correct name, the Church at the Green, the first Congregational Church at the Green. And the building that exists now is really the fourth building. The original was started, the church was started in 1694, and that's actually a little later. Most towns couldn't have become a town, and Middleborough was incorporated in 1669. So we have a beginning of this official establishment in 1694. The present building was actually built in 1828. Beautiful place to see, classic New England Greek Revival, Ionic kind of look to it, with columns and all the things that go with it, and wonderful. If you haven't ever been inside, go inside and see the incredible decorative paint that has been redone. And it's been done, it was actually done first in, I think, 1855. It's trompe l'oeil, that fools your eye. It makes it look three-dimensional when it's really flat surfaces. So all that is a little bit of the history of what makes this part of town really kind of one of the special parts. We're going to be heading right across the street, taking a closer look at the cemetery at the Green, which is its correct name. We actually were recently educated by the Gravestone Girls, an outside group that came in and did a presentation. They didn't call these early places cemeteries. These were burial grounds or graveyards. So the word cemetery really came along later, but it is now very much called Cemetery at the Green. So we'll be heading over there. Goes back to about the 18 or so is some of the earliest things. One of the first gravestones in here says that the person died in 18. So sometime around there is when the first burials were happening here. It is not the first burial ground of the community. The first burial ground is actually in Mascot Hill, and we'll do there sometime and have a nice visit through that. But we're going to stop here for a moment, walk across the street, pick right up over there, and give you a little bit of a tour of a colonial era burial ground, which is what that is. And it's an amazing one, very, very large for a small community like Middleborough. It's really an amazing structure for us to have that many colonial era stones. So we'll see in just a moment. Here we are now across the street over in the cemetery at the Green. One or two quick things about the church, which I really had meant to speak of while we were over there. And that is that there's some very interesting folks involved with that church. Of course, as you very well know, the first minister was named Fuller. He's directs the son of, this is Samuel Fuller, and the school that is functioning over there now was, of course, named after him. And he was the son of a person who came over on the Mayflower and came here and is the first minister of the church. So he's the first minister of the church. But during those years and up to the Revolution, some interesting folks came. Ben Franklin visited here, for that matter, along with a number of Massachusetts governors and other things. So we have some interesting history with people who actually came and attended services at that congregation. But now let us talk about cemeteries, or burial grounds, which is, as I said, the more correct term. And what's amazing about this is to have this collection of colonial era stones all here, hundreds and hundreds of them, which is unusual. Many communities will have 15 or 20 or 35 or something or other. We have hundreds of these stones, and almost all of them locally made. We did a program, our second program was what we call Cemetery Basics, and I'm going to take a minute just to again kind of cover that for those of you who might have missed it, so you get the arrangement, because this is a classic orientation and structure. You'll notice that we have rows of stones that go in straight lines pretty much. Their orientation is no accident. All of this was connected to their religious views, and they were very, very much a community that believed in a resurrection and an afterlife. The second coming was going to come along at some point or other. And with that, these stones are all in an east-west arrangement. They are all one after another, lined up with an east-west orientation here. The arrangement is, that's the west, and that's right now where the sun is starting to go down. We're filming this in the later afternoon, early evening. Sun's going down over there in the west, and in the morning it would come up here in the east. Now, these stones are headstones. There is, for many, many stones, we'll show you a little bit, another little stone that should have been right back in here somewhere, called a footstone. And the person, when they were buried, this has all the writing on it in the image, you'd be reading that, but the person would have been buried right here. So I'm standing above where this person was buried, and his footstone would have been right here. His head there, his or her foot here. And that orientation, again, was all connected to their religious beliefs. When the Second Coming happened, they believed that all of these folks are going to rise up. And when they rose up, the intent was that they rise up facing Jerusalem, facing the east. So they'd rise up facing the east. So this is a classic New England graveyard burial ground orientation. These line after line of east-west stones with a headstone and a footstone. Now, where are the footstones now? The footstone that existed with this stone is lost. It's gone. It's not here. For many stones, and we'll show you this as we walk around, someone picks it up and sticks it behind there. Most of that is so that they could cut the grass, something they didn't worry about in colonial time. But nowadays, with our mechanized machines and everything else, and we'll talk about some of the problems related to that, they've picked these up and many get lost along the way. So headstone, footstone, person here, rising up facing the east. So that's kind of the basic of colonial era cemeteries. As I said, what's amazing about Middleborough is that we have so many of them. Now, one of the things we're going to do, besides give you that little primer about gravestones and graveyards, is take you a little bit through time. Our colonial ones, which are the ones, candidly, I'm most interested in, go from about 1700 through 1800. And then they start changing. And we're going to take another break, just walk down and show you how this changed as we move into the next century. All right, we've moved down along the front of the burial ground, but actually we've moved about 100 years or so, because we're now around the 1810, 1820 time period with the stones that are behind me. And you might notice some differences. First of all, they're not made out of the same stuff. Our colonial era stones, especially those that are right here from Middleborough, are made out of a local slate. Slate, sedimentary rock, fairly soft, easy to work, grayish in color. We'll talk about some of the problems with slate after a little while, but the typical colonial era stone is a slate stone. Now here behind me you'll see a variety of stones that are kind of strange colors here. Some of them almost black, and some of them almost white, and some of them gray in betweens, and all kinds of things about them. And the minute you start seeing these kinds of stones, you don't have to read the dates on them. You can tell right away. There's a couple of things to notice. First, as I said, they are a different material. This is white marble. These are stones brought in. These are not locally generated stones or made stones. The carvers are somewhere else. So these are brought in, much like present-day gravestones. So they were brought in, sold to people locally, and put in here. So by the 1820s, 1830s, we start seeing the end of Middleborough's historically made-in-town stones and start having these kinds of stones that are white marble. Again, just the changes that happened. But you might notice something else, and that is this group here put in a fence is probably one family. That's not unusual. We have family groups out here. But notice their orientation compared to everybody else. We had for 100 years east-west absolute strict obedience to the structure, and all of a sudden we have a whole family who's facing the wrong way. I want to think this is a change in the strictness of the religious process that was going on. Was there still clearly an interest and an expectation of a second coming and of a resurrection? I'm sure there still was, there still is today. But the process of being asked to stay strictly in line was something that somehow or other started to be lost. And with that, you start seeing stones that face all kinds of directions for whatever reason. So another sign of the change that came along. Now, white marble stones, you can see, don't stay white, and we'll talk about some of the problems that happen with that and some of the other difficulties. I find them not that this is a matter of interest, but the colonial era stones will do subsequent shows about their images and the wording and all kinds of things that I find them fascinating about. But they're still part of our history. They're part of the folks who lived in this community. but they no longer have some of the same images that we were expected to see in the colonial era stones. So we'll look at all that kind of stuff, but even with that, you can see 150, 200 years ago almost now, changes happening in our burial practices. No longer the strict orientation east-west, no longer local slate, no longer local cutters. So we'll take another jump in history and show you the next step. Okay, we've just kind of slid over a little bit, but again another 100-year jump, because behind me right now is a family marker, a family monument, and again a family plot. This says Father and Mother and Mary, so a small family group right here below me and to the sides of me. But behind, this is a granite marker, what we're so much more used to in the 20th century and 21st century. And you can see this one covers some burials, people who died in 1909, 1918, 1929, so this was probably done in the 30s or 40s or something like that. And if I walk over here, you can see behind me, this is still an active cemetery. The cemetery at the Green still has burial plots available, and down below are our typical modern cemetery plots with normal markers in various colored granites that are down there. And now we have all kinds of things with pictures put on them and photographs and you name it, all kinds of variations that happen with that. But after a while, if you get into this bit of walking through our cemeteries, you can tell really the era you're in just by, from a distance, looking at the stones. Our colonial stones are very, very, very clear, slate gray, small, very primitive. Then by the 1800s we get into the white marble stones. They have their problems, and they're actually in some ways disappearing faster than our slate stones. And then we hit the 20th century and we start getting into granite. Granite is a much harder stone, doesn't have the kind of flaws that our slate has, and most likely is going to last much, much longer than our colonial era stones. And we will wrap this up towards the end of our program today and talk about some of the things that are real dangers to these stones as we go forward. So this is our little quick walk through a cemetery to show you from burial ground to cemetery time to modern plots, a little bit of how we've changed in our culture of burying folks and recognizing and trying to leave a memorial to those of our ancestors who were ahead of us. Okay, here we are back on the time that I must admit I enjoy the most, which is these colonial era times. And you know, I've been writing little articles in the Gazette that I've been calling Stories in the Stones. And one of the ones I wrote has to do with a family that is right here where I'm standing. And so I thought it would be kind of fun to just to kind of catch you up. And my point being that you don't have to do incredible research on these folks. You can often tell things if you just slow down long enough to take a moment and read these stones. Something that I'd encourage you to do quickly now, because I tell you 50 years from now for many of these stones it will be impossible to read them. Already many of these stones are unreadable. So there are problems coming the way of these colonial era stones. We're still fortunate to live here now when we can still see much of it, but it's going, and now's the time. But walking through on a beautiful day, if you slow down and take a look, you can see the kind of things that tell us how life was in those days. And part of that is to do with what was, again, a very, very old family. This is a Bennett's, B-E-N-N-E-T, is the way it is on all of these stones. So in some parts of the family, it's very, again, common to see different, even name spellings. You'd think there'd be a consistency there. That's not necessarily so. Often Bennett is with two T's. So B-E-N-N-E-T. And the family goes back to I believe, let me take a quick look and make sure I'm talking about it right. The Bennett family, Middleborough early colony. Deacon John Bennett originally came from England, landed in, of all places, Virginia, not a Plymouth, not a Mayflower folk, but moved to Salem and then ultimately to Middleborough. We believe he died in 1718. I'm not sure he's buried here. He's not right here where we are. At age 76, his wife Deborah died the very next day. Who knows why. He was a selectman and served as town clerk for 13 years, according to the Western history of Middleborough. And that's another place. We'll talk about the Western history. It's a great place to go to find out if you want to research any of these folks. But the family I wanted to talk about is one of Deacon John's descendants, and his name is Ebenezer, and his wife's name is Esther. And they're right here in an interesting stone in that it is a double stone. It has two tops to it, if you know what I mean. It is a single Middleborough stone, and it was was cut here, but Esther and Ebenezer were married and were there. The reason I use them as an interesting example of life and how it was tough is because of these 4 or 5 stones right along here beside me. These are their children, and it gives you some idea of the kinds of things that these colonial era families lived with and unfortunately had happened to them. Almost all of these children died in their first year. In fact, I think out of these 5 stones, 4 of them are stillborn children. So these children never survived their birth. Not a terribly unusual thing. What's unusual is that these children were given stones. Very often those babies would be buried, and they did not. Just as these children are not given names, they were not even in many cases given stones. So there may many more people here who, as infants, were buried here without markers along the way. Another of these is a daughter who died after just a few months of age, and then there's actually one stone that is up here right beside them that is a daughter who did live into her 40s. So you can see, however, the kinds of things that were the life of that day, where these children, it was not unusual to have children die. In fact, in some cases, it was not unusual to see a whole family wiped out in a week with some kind of a contagious disease came into town and did something or other. Now, at the same time, you can see extremes. Another Bennett relative who was buried here was a woman who lives to be 99, and this is again in colonial era times. So you see extremes just as we can see today, but they lived much closer to death, and with that, their culture of death and how to handle death was there. I'm wearing my little T-shirt because it says on it what they lived with and what we think is part of the message that the dead had to the living. This says, "Strangers stop and cast an eye," just as I'm asking you to look at cemetery stones now. "As you are now, so once was I. As I am now, so you must be. Prepare for death and follow me." So they're busy trying to speak to the living. We'll do more about this as we go on and talk more about the images on stones, the epitaphs on stones, the things that are on these stones besides just names and deaths, dates and birth dates. So, but the Bennett family is a kind of a example of the things that you'll find if you stop, slow down long enough, look at the stones. This one couple had a number of children die very, very young. Another thing I didn't pick a family to show you this, but it's not unusual to see one husband and several wives. And you read and often find the first wife died in childbirth. Second wife died of some other contagious thing. Third wife may have lived to be more of an age. And you wonder what was, well, this man, if he was a farmer, absolutely, and had children already, had to have a woman come into that house and help take care of it. So life was hard. Death was always close, and in some cases very sudden. And the Bennett family is an interesting example of that. We'll go off and show you another story in just a sec. All right, here we are. I thought another quick stop. In fact, this is just 5 or 6 stones right along the very front of the cemetery at the Green. This is Lieutenant Jacob Thompson, T-O-M-S-O-N. Again, often a name that is spelled a couple of ways. T-H-O-M-S-O-N or P-S-O-N is there. But Lieutenant, and as you go along, you're often, especially, we're not too far from Memorial Day, and you can see that this has a flag beside it. This Lieutenant Jacob Thompson is being recognized as a veteran. And I thought we might use him as just an example of a couple things. First, again, the arrangement. Here's his headstone, and we'll get a good picture that you'll see of the front of this stone, and it shows you his name and calls him Lieutenant. This is his footstone. Move from up here to behind the stone. It does say Lieutenant Thompson, 1789, which is his death date. So that this is 10 years after the Revolution or more, something in that range. But I kind of bring him up because as an example of how also we're very fortunate in Middleborough to have ways to find out about folks if you choose to. And you can do this a couple of ways. Nowadays online, if you go to Ancestry.com or any of the number of various places, or Google Revolutionary War soldiers, you'll find that much of this you can find online. I would encourage you, though, to visit the Middleborough Library. And I went there, and asked Anil Bowker for a special permission to borrow a book just to show you. This is Massachusetts Soldiers and Sailors of the American Revolution. And this is volume 15 of 17. So there are 17 of these great big books. And we'll use the lieutenant's stone for just a moment. And if you go down under Thompson, there's Jacob Thompson, Private Lieutenant, Jonah Washburn's company, a Middleborough name. Colonel Ebenezer Sproat's regiment. Sproat, remember, that's the same as the tavern was, another Middleborough name. Serviced 5 days. This is not at all unusual. And when you were in the militia, you went off on quick things. Company marched from Middleborough to Rhode Island on the alarm of December 8th, 1776. Also, Captain Jonah Washburn's company, Colonel Ebenezer White's regiment, marched August 1st, 1780, discharged August 9th, 1780, service 9 days. Company marched to Rhode Island on the alarm of August 1st, 1780. Roll sworn to at Middleborough. So this man served really a matter of days, but for all that time he was in the militia and an officer in the militia. And so this is the kind of thing you can find. And so I'd encourage you, if you think you've got Revolutionary War connections, you can find out the specifics of these kinds of things very, very easily just by looking them up there if they're Massachusetts folks. And then one more book, and this is the Tom Weston history. Thompson is again one of classic old Middleborough families, and there are Thompsons all over this cemetery. And if you go to the index, you'll find Thompsons were part of 26 Man's Purchase and early settlers, very, very involved with all kinds of things. And there are 3 or 4 or 5 generations of Thompsons, many of them right here. Here's our Lieutenant Jacob is son of a Jacob who's right there. That's the father. So all in all, you can find these things, see these connections, look up their stories, find out what happened to them as they lived in this town very, very easily. It's fun to see, educational for your kids if you're wondering about that, and it just kind of makes it so that these things that we drive by every day and hardly think about really start coming alive. You get to know who they were, what they did, and realize that these people have an interesting story to tell us even today. Here I am by one of my favorite stones in this place, and an unusual stone. First of all, a relatively famous man, connects to a couple of the things we've said before. This is the Reverend Sylvanus Conant, and he is the 4th minister of the church at the Green. And he is the one that really was the minister and almost a rabble-rouser for the American Revolution. So in the 1760s and 70s, he was very much into the fervor of the Revolution and encouraged the revolutionary spirit of this community. So it's an unusual stone in a couple of ways. First of all, is one of the few stones here that most likely was not cut here in Middleborough. It's bigger than the stones that we have made in Middleborough by and large. I think it's a little different color because I don't think it's local slate. And also it is unusual in the quality of it in a couple of ways. Also, the images. We will talk about the tops of stones at another thing, but cemetery stones do not have pictures of the person who's buried there, with 1 or 2 exceptions, and that is military men sometimes were pictured in uniform, and ministers. And this is Sylvanus right here, with a wig and a clerical collar right here. Now, he was the most important guy in town, the best educated, the most significant to the community. And he is considered to be almost saintly in his own way. And this stone says, this stone is erected to the blessed memory of that truly evangelic preacher, that amiable pattern of charity in all its branches, the Reverend Sylvanus Conant. I get a kick out of this because here they are writing in stone. Here's Sylvanus, his first name Cone A. They don't have room to get his name in here. There's a little an NT up above. So this is kind of one of those plan ahead mistakes, okay? But despite that, pastor of the Church of Middleborough, the first church of Middleborough, and who died of smallpox about 3 miles from hence where his body lies interred. He died, I think, I'm not being able to read this very well. I'm going to spray a little water. It just makes it a little easier to see. where lies interred. He died December 8th, 1777, in the 58th year of his age, in the 33rd of his ministry. So he died at 58 years old, 33 years as a minister. So the Sylvanus Conant stone is not a headstone. This is what is correctly called a cenotaph, which means it is a memorial stone. His headstone is where he's buried, which is out on Soul Street, right on the border of Halifax. So the Sylvanus Conant, one of the few people in town who has two cemetery stones, this one here at the cemetery at the Green and the other one over at the Smallpox Cemetery. He went out there to be a good Christian and to do his service. He was healthy, but unfortunately caught smallpox in the outbreak in 1777, and died out there. Again, you can see more of his story, though, just by who's right beside him. This is his wife's stone, and she died at age 28 in, I think, 1750. So in the 1750s she died. And this is his son's stone. So again, you can read families and get some idea of the kinds of things that happen to them as they go along. So that's Sylvanus Conant, one of my favorites, one of the most unusual stones here. I kind of stopped at this one just to kind of give you a little teaser of a show that I'm sure we'll be doing in the next 1 or 2 or 3 of these little epics into the burial grounds. This is not a terribly unusual stone in any way except for its imagery, and that's what's up top. I'll read you the stone just so you hear. Here lies the body of Mrs. Sarah Smith, who wife to Mr. Jonathan Smith, who died June 5th, 1744, in the 49th year of her age. So not a terribly interesting thing, unless there's some interesting background story that we don't know about the Smiths. But we will do a thing about these headstones. These, as I said when we talked about our friend Sylvanus Conant, that's a portrait. This is not meant to be a portrait. These are called either death's heads or soul effigies. And this one is actually kind of a little transitional one, because this hollow-eyed skeletal structure looks like a skull, and that would be called, by the gravestone people who are interested in this stuff, as I am, that would be called a death's head. But here we see this funny little thing, 2 eyes, looks like a little nose, a little neck. And that little thing, we're quite sure is a soul effigy. This is a sign that out of death the soul is released. At least that's our interpretation. And we're going to do a program about all this and see how that process goes through. This is some of the stuff that I find interesting as you look at these stones. Again, part of this is connected to their religious views, but it is kind of the stuff you can see if you bother to school yourself. I can also, I don't have to have it with me now, but you can tell exactly who cut this stone. And we'll walk through here, and these hundreds of stones are all made by about 10 or 12 or 15 different folk. And we'll be able to tell you who they are in many, many cases, just by how they're cut. So that's the things that go on, and that's one of the things we'll be doing with future stones. But it's, again, part of the stories that you can find in these stones is how they tried to speak to us. In this case, soul leaving death, heading up. This is probably going to be the last of our little stone stories, but I thought we'd take you to perhaps one of the very earliest stones in this place. And this looks small, and often that sometimes used to tell you this was a baby. Well, that's not so. This is an early stone, and this is one of the first stones cut by a man that we don't know his name. In fact, we only call him the first Middleborough carver. He was an extremely primitive craftsman. When it came to any curve, he could do it only if he could make a compass line. So you'll see a center dot and a circle. This stone reads, here lies the body of Ruth Cobb, aged, we think 27 years, died October 7th, 1717. So this is one of the earliest stones, we believe, that's in here, and 1717 is a very early Middleborough stone. Again, don't know much about Ruth Cobb, though Cobb has a very old Middleborough name and a very old Mayflower name, and we could go back and, I'm sure, find more about the Cobbs. One of the shows that we will do will be about the cutters, what we call the cutters, the stone cutters. Middleborough stone cutters overall were usually people who did something else. it was 100 years, not until we get to the time of the white stones, so we have people who really made a living out of cutting gravestones. Most did this as kind of a second thing. They would be farmers all summer and winter, and then the winter when they couldn't farm, they might cut gravestones. A number of them, actually, one of our Middleborough gravestone cutters was the town clerk. And so you find that these men often had other jobs and then cut stones on the side. So, but this is a very, very historical stone, and one that, again, goes back to perhaps the earliest times of this burial ground, about 1717. We're going to finish up here by just kind of taking you to one of the sad realities of this, and that is that all of this stuff is disappearing, and we're going to show you why as part of what's happening to our historic cemeteries and our historic burial grounds, which is kind of a sad reality. But as I said earlier on, we may be the last generations who can come and see these things. So we'll take you to one or two of the problems that we have here and the things that you can see again if you'll come and just take a look around. Okay, here we are, kind of wrapping it up with some of the complications and sad realities of what's happening to some of these colonial era stones. And we just stopped at this this tree growing right up, and you can get an idea of the kinds of things that happen in these cemeteries, burial grounds over time. Here we have a colonial era stone. I could go down there and probably tell you who it is, but no idea. Another stone right beside it that's in pieces. I just picked up this section of it, and it does say son of Mr. Holmes and Mrs. Molly, his wife, who died September 28th. I can't quite tell when, but by this looks like the 1760s. So this, again, this stone is in pieces now. How it ever got broken in the first place, it's hard to tell. But this tree is growing right up and dumping these stones over and destroying them and damaging them. Over here there's another example of a stone that goes way, way back. But you can get some idea that the whole front of this is flaked off and is gone. This is where that image would be, where that death's head or soul effigy would be. And the details of this person would be written here. It's impossible to reconstruct this stone now. All that factual information is gone, and with it the image that went with it is also lost forever. So this stone probably had some built-in failures, built-in fracture lines. These sedimentary rocks, which is what slate is, are notoriously poor at withstanding long periods of time. They're basically meant to be flat, and we've stand them up on end, and with that they start breaking apart, as you can see breaks here, and in this case a large piece of it has fallen right off and has been lost. It may well be buried under here, more likely is just thrown away someplace or other. So these kinds of things are the things that we can see all over this cemetery. We see stones in pieces. I'm going to move forward here to actually a white marble stone. So this stone right in front is a stone that has been broken in half. This is white marble and could perhaps be put back together. We may give it a try some point or other to do that, but that takes special techniques to do those kinds of things. So even stones from 100 years later or more have their problems and are in tough shape around here. You can find them all over as you look about. Again, stones in pieces, stones that no longer are a solid piece, now fractured into 2 or 3 or 4 pieces. We may well be able to tell who that is. For one thing, here is his footstone. That may give us some information. But this stuff just cannot and does not last forever, and as I say, we may be seeing the last of it in the next 100 years. We'll show you 1 or 2 other small problems as well. This is a stone that kind of, again, shows you how easy it is to lose things and what is happening. This stone, I'll read it to you. It says, "Here lies the body of Mary Cobb, daughter of John Cobb, who deceased April the 30th in Domini, the 1727, aged 9 months." And that's all right here in this little piece right here. But this stone was buried from this point down and probably had more to it than this. This, by the way, is an interesting thing. This is the stonecutter's mark, H. I can tell you who this is when I look up the image, but H is his mark, so this is a stonecutter's mark, about the only way they ever signed their work. But this was up out of the ground, lying against a tree over here, and had, before we made it dark with some water just so you could see it better, it was covered with, again, little stripes of the lawnmower. So this has been repeatedly hit poked and actually knocked out of the ground. And it's the kind of thing that happens again to our colonial era stones, and especially a small, beautiful little stone like this. So it's kind of a shame to see this little guy up out of this Mary's stone, Mary Cobb stone, but it is the kind of thing that is happening again as we try and take care of our cemeteries and unfortunately in some cases do damage to the stones. All right, I think we're going to wrap this up with this last little bit here and show you just one or two of the other kinds of things that happen to these wonderful stones. We showed you earlier our first Middleborough carver stone. This is another Middleborough carver stone, and so one of the earliest stones of this burial ground. His name, we can't make it out, his name is William Dexter, but what I really want you to see is the stripes that are on there, and that is not put on by the carver. These are lines that have been put on by lawnmowers or weed whackers. Unfortunately, our attempts to again make these areas attractive and help to have people feel comfortable to come here and walk around does damage to these soft stones. And this stone has been hit repeatedly by lawnmowers, weed whackers, and has started to cut into the very crude lettering that was done by our first Middleborough carver. This also has a fracture line along here, and the side of it has been damaged. That's a fault of the stone, but this is a problem with just basic care, and another thing that happens to our stones. And then finally, another reality. This is a stone that with some work we probably could read, but it shows you the kinds of things that happen to our stones, and in the long run does damage and also makes them so that we can't appreciate the information that's there. This slate stone, I can't quite make out when it was originally cut, but probably by its look goes back to its 1730s, 1740s, has lichens growing on it. Now lichens are a combination of an algae and a fungus, and it grows on bare rock. But as it grows there, if it just sat there and didn't do anything, that might not be so bad, but it does produce an acid, and it literally starts eating the front of the stone. So lichens grow on this. Some of them we can rub off, but many of them are so well attached that we can't get them off this way. There's actually a new substance we're doing a little experimenting with called D2 biological solution that will help kill this and make it so that we can see this stone and read it again. But many of these stones are on the edge of being unreadable, and it's because of the lichen growth that is on there. Middleborough, for whatever reason, seems to have an unusual healthy growing condition for lichens, and they grow on our stones like mad and make them so that we can hardly see them. So this is another of the problems of our stones. So we have here what I think of as an incredible amount of material. While we're talking about one last thing, we're going to move over to this veteran stone. These are two veterans. Again, white marble, so I can tell you these are veterans perhaps of, they might be Revolutionary War veterans because some of them lived into the 1800s and had that type of a stone, but these stones are just about unreadable. I can tell you from knowing stones that this is an urn and willow up here, but you can just barely make out that, and that was the deepest carving. You can't read hardly anything here. We might possibly be able to figure out what that is, but very, very difficult. White marble has a different problem, and that is acid rain attacks white marble. This is an acid-base reaction. And so these stones are crumbling in the last 50 years as acids get into our atmosphere, fall down as acid rain, and eat up these marble stones. So there's all kinds of things attacking these pieces of history, and we're going to work at trying to do some reconstructing of damaged stones and preservation of stones as best we can, but some are being lost and lost forever. Another part of what we may very well do is archive some of these with images and in written records. Some of that already exists, but we may also go forward further with that. So we'll have you back for another visit to one of our historic cemeteries. We'll see. I'm kind of thinking next time we might take you to a cemetery that has no stones, and we'll talk about why that happened. So we'll see about that as we go along, but thank you for visiting. And again, I would encourage you to come out, see these places. Don't just drive by them in your car. Come, stop, walk through them. They're very pleasant, delightful little spots to visit. But on top of that, you can just read a family's history in these stones. Or if you take a moment, do a little research on the internet or with the local things in the library, you can find out about some of these people who were our early patriots and the famous or infamous folks of our community. And there are both in our community. So take a moment, learn their stories, find out about them, and enjoy our historic cemeteries.